Welcome to the Made for Agriculture podcast.
Hello, welcome to another episode of the Made for Agriculture podcast. I'm Landry Jones. With me today is David Moore, and from Corteva we have Brent Mettler. We figured we'd bring this podcast to you and talk a little bit about forage management. Today is February 16th, 2026, and I know here in southern part of Missouri, southern part of our trade territory, a lot of folks with the weather we've been having are getting grass fever on their mind. Them cattle are out kind of picking in the grass. We got some rain, and people's mindset is to start preparing for spring growth. And so I thought I'd have these two folks on to talk about that, and hopefully kind of throw out some ideas or some management tips to make sure everybody's successful moving forward this spring with forage production. So, before we get started, I will kick it over to Brent and have him introduce himself and tell everyone kind of who you are and where you're from.
Yep. Thanks, Landry. I'm Brent Mettler with Corteva. I'm the Range and Pasture Herbicide Specialist for Corteva. I cover basically South Kansas City, southern Missouri, all the way to northern half of Arkansas, specifically working on our Range and Pasture Herbicide business. And so with that, I have worked with MFA for a number of years, and glad to be here to talk about some different ideas and some tips and some things to think about as we try to prepare for spring. It really feels like spring has sprung over the last week or so with 70-degree days, and a little bit of chance there might be a little bit of green grass starting to peak up out there, and a little bit of moisture this weekend, and I think that really helped move things along. No doubt we'll have more winter upon us before this is all over with, but it really does at least get your mind thinking towards spring and some things that you can do to get more out of your pasture and try to grow more grass. That's kind of our goal in general.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that was also kind of why I wanted to do this episode, is because I think we're all aware it is just February 16th. We probably still got some winter ahead of us. People sometimes jump the gun a little bit, in my opinion, on putting on some fertilizer that we may not get the most out of because it's maybe a little bit too early, and we'll get into that conversation a little bit later. But I think everybody's fully aware of what the cattle market's like right now for cattle producers. It's the best it's probably ever been. And so there's some folks around the countryside that for tax purposes or just because of the income that they have this year are looking for ways to maybe reduce that tax burden that they might see at the end of this year. And so sometimes that easy button is a new pickup or a new tractor or a new piece of equipment, which we probably all need. We've been in a situation the last decade or so with very low income for cattle producers, and some of that equipment, some of those things need to be updated. And so I won't fault anybody for doing that, but wanted to just make sure that people are aware. I hear this a lot at some of the conferences I go to, but we probably should think of ourselves first as grass farmers before we're cattle farmers. And grass, the forage, is the foundation to our operation and to our profitability and success in this cattle world. And so just like I said, wanted to have this conversation to make sure that if we got a little extra money to spend as cattle producers this year, think about maybe putting it back into your pastures so that as we roll into 2026, we've got a lot of good forage out there for cattle. We're as productive as we can be. We all know that's the cheapest way or easiest way to make money on cattle is to have them grazing as long as possible on our operation. And the more we got to feed them, usually that dips into our pocketbook a little harder. And so I think there's some things right now in February, mid-February, going into spring that we can think about, consider to either start implementing now or to just kind of write down, jot some notes that when that time comes, we're ready to make some decisions on our forage management, that we've got a few things that we might consider when we start making those moves. So I guess just to kind of kick it off, we had in our territory, most of all of our territory last year in 2025, we had a lot of really good hay production. It seemed like 75% of our annual rain came in May, June, and a little bit of July. We were obviously dry rolling into last fall, but we had probably more hay production on our land this year last year than we've had in a long time. And so that kind of leads into my conversation of, if we had excess forage production and we harvested that with hay machinery, that we removed a lot of nutrients out of that soil. Every ton of cool season grass hay is about 45 pounds of nitrogen, about 12, 15 pounds of phosphorus, and about 50 pounds of potassium. And so keep that in mind. Try to remember back last year on what you took off of that hay field, and consider what maybe we need to put back. So that's kind of the first step to consider. I would say the first management step would be to pull some soil samples. A lot of times we don't do that. I'm guilty as well sometimes of not seeing what my soils are doing fertility wise before I just go out there and go to the co-op, go to MFA and purchase some fertilizer and spread it out there, not knowing what I really need. So I would challenge people to, at a bare minimum, pull some composite soil samples to try to see where you're at. I think it's tough to make recommendations from an agronomy standpoint of what a producer needs. I'm sure David and Brand as well get calls from producers saying, "Hey, I've got this forage base. What do you recommend for fertilizer?" And we can kind of tell them, "Well, this is what you're going to remove." But without soil samples, it's very difficult to give a real good detailed prescription of what that producer needs. So at a bare minimum, composite soil samples, but I would challenge folks to look at grid soil sampling. NutriTrack is a program that MFA offers that is based on, well, I'll tell you what, I'll let David talk. He's a little better, a little more knowledgeable on this subject and can bring a little bit more insight for cattle producers. So David, if you don't care, tell folks kind of what NutriTrack is, the benefits to that, and what livestock cattle producers can see from using that service.
Okay. Well, I guess to start with, we could talk about the composite sample, because it's easiest to talk about NutriTrack once we understand the pros and the cons of a composite. If I get 12 or 15 cores from a field, and I mix those all together in a bucket and I send that off, the lab is going to give me results on my phosphorus and potassium levels and my pH that is an average of the soil submitted, which means if I look at the phosphorus level, half of the field is better than that, half of the field is not as good as that. Okay. So we all understand that that's average. Okay. Then they're going to give me a recommendation of, okay, if I want to make 2 tons of fescue hay this year, this is how much nitrogen, how much phosphorus, and how much potassium. And they're using those average numbers to give me an average fertility recommendation. Here's where I finally completely understood grid sampling and why it works like it does. If I follow that sample, I'm overfeeding half of the field and I'm underfeeding half of the field. And here's the part that took me the longest to understand. I'm overfeeding the part of the field that's not returning yield to me. And I'm underfeeding the part of the field that will always give everything it's got back to you. Because there's places in your field that kind of tie up nutrients and they just sit there and they build and they build and they build without returning yield to you. Why are they building? Because I'm putting the same 200 pounds per acre on every year, and it goes across the whole field. When I grid sample, I take that same field and I break it into 2.5 acre plots on a map, and we go to the center of each one of those, and we pull a composite sample from around that center point. So I know what every 2.5 acres, what it has and what it needs exactly. So I can spoon feed exactly what it needs. So for the cattle guy, I make this comparison. I ask him the question, do you have cows in your herd that are pretty easy keepers and they're pretty fleshy? Yeah, I got some of those. I said, do you have cows in your herd that are they're pretty bony because they're milking hard and they're giving everything to their calf? Yeah, I got some of those. I say, wouldn't it be cool if when you feed cubes, you could feed the cubes to that bony cow that's giving everything she's got to her calf and withhold it from the fleshy cow that doesn't need any more right now? Well, yeah, it'd be really neat. Well, we can do that with the grass by using NutriTrack. We put fertilizer where it's needed in the amount that it's needed, and if it needs none, it gets none. We do the same thing with lime. We put it where it's needed and only where it's needed. And the lime is one of the most important parts of the equation from the standpoint of when, as pH falls and the soil becomes acidic and we start thinking, hey, I need to put lime on, fertilizer is becoming less available to the plant. And we want to bring it up to that 6.5 to 7.3 range because all of the nutrients are available to the plant. And that's a pH range where all the plants we want to grow are happy. So it's just kind of a sweet spot. If you go above that 7.3, get back in, up in the 8 range and above, you're creating the same environment where we're tying nutrients up again. So those blanket shot in the dark, well, I think it probably needs 3 tons to the acre, might get you in trouble because it doesn't. It's a kind of a crazy equation that lime gets calculated on, but it doesn't take anywhere near as much lime to go from 7 to 8 as it does to go, from 6 to 7. It's 1/10. So it pretty quick you can over apply and have yourself in a pickle. But variable rate technology has been around a long time, and it does a world of good for the row crop guys. And I was really slow to adopt it for cattle guys for grass. Our dairies helped convince me that I was missing the boat by not doing it because they live and die by efficiency, and they clearly said this works, and it gives us 30 to 35% minimum more production on the same number of pounds of fertilizer. So that's why NutriTrack really works. Some would say 30% is not very much, and I might tend to agree, I might tend to disagree. But if I put $1 in your hand and I put $1.30 in somebody else's hand, or let's make it a bigger number, I put $1,000 in your hand and I put $1,300 in your buddy's hand, which hand do you want to have? That's the long and the short of it. 30% does make a difference.
Well, and I think you start getting, in the southern part of our territory, we've got a diversity of soils, and livestock production does not distribute nutrients out the backside of that cow evenly, right? As they're walking across the field. And so I think, from just knowing that base fertility from a grid soil sampling standpoint is it potentially more critical than in the north part of our territory where there's more homogeneous soil types and a little bit less diversity from that standpoint. So now it's I think, like I said, I think in the world we live in with the price of inputs, trying to be as efficient as possible and be good stewards of the land, NutriTrack falls right in line with what we're trying to accomplish or what producers are trying to accomplish. And it's pretty cool to see a truck that has the variable rate spreading technology go across the field and slow down that belt as it's going over those areas that may not need that fertility, and then literally 50 yards away it kicks the belt on and hyperdrive to make up for those lower fertility areas. And so it's pretty good technology, and like I said, I think in our pasture situations and hay ground situations for sure as well, it just makes sense to consider that. And I would also throw out, I kind of came into this situation several years ago. We bought a piece of property, pasture, that I didn't have the background on the fertility and what that previous landowner had done. And so just knowing kind of the ground level where you're starting at can be very beneficial, because you don't know the past history use. I mean, going back 50, 100 years, it may have been an old dairy that, they dumped all the manure, within a few acre area, a few acres of an area, and you wouldn't know that if you didn't pull grid soil samples. And so, anyways, I think it's technology we all need to be looking at in the world that we live in today with where we're at, finance wise and economy wise. So, I think that's awesome. I would say, let's kind of roll into maybe application timing. I mentioned kind of a little bit earlier about that. We are, we've had a fairly mild winter so far. We've been lacking some moisture up until a few days ago, but now we're still seeing above average temperatures. The grass is starting to green up a little bit. If there hasn't been some fertilizer in the southern part of our territory hit the ground, I would be surprised. But David, what would you, if you have a producer that's got some pasture and or hay ground, what's your kind of go-to for the optimal time to be spreading some fertilizer?
So when I start thinking about hay ground, I want to catch that hay ground as that field is waking up. I would love to put my P&K on in the fall. I know we're past fall right now, but I'm going to take just a second to really harp on that. The reason for putting P&K on in the fall, some would tell you, well, it takes 6 months for it to be available to the plant. That's just not necessarily true. What does happen, though, is that phosphorus and potash goes to work and allows those roots to heal up over the wintertime. All the abuse that they went through the last growing season, they heal up. We see roots really diving deep into the soil. And come springtime, that grass, it wakes up healthier, happier, and earlier. So P&K in the fall is a good thing. So either way, whether you're putting P&K on now or you did it in the fall, we've got sulfur and nitrogen that need to be applied in the springtime. And I look at, middle of May as being kind of my beginning for hay ground. Middle of March, I'm sorry. Middle of March to about the 10th or 15th of April, something like that. By the 15th of April, typically I'm in 8-inch tall grass. If weather is average, it'll be 8 inches tall or so, but you'll turn it on. One of the things to remember with applying nitrogen to grass, the earlier I apply, the more stem and seed head I am going to promote. The later I apply, the more blades of grass I'm going to promote. So if I'm one of those people that is going to combine fescue seed, I'm probably looking at applying my nitrogen around Christmas to New Year's to optimize seed production. Now, that late March, early April is just fine. That's a good compromise for hay production. If you wait any later, you're going to miss production opportunities. So that's my thoughts. Now, pasture ground, I'm looking at late April into early May, maybe even as much as, the 15th of May. Part of my reason for doing that is that God gives us more grass than we know what to do with typically in the spring. If you're not getting enough grass for that to happen, one of two things is going on. Either we really, really need to pull soil tests and see why we're not getting grass, or we may be just grossly overstocked. So typically what I like to do is kind of wait for the cattle to begin to catch up to the grass that we've got in the spring, and then apply fertilizer and try to do it, a few weeks ahead of when the cattle are going to hit that particular pasture. I'm not necessarily a fan of hooking onto a fertilizer cart the 15th of March and covering all of my acres, and then at the end of that time wiping my hands and saying I'm done. I think we're doing our land a disservice. I think we're doing our pocketbook a disservice when we do that. Timely applications can do things like that May 15th application of fertilizer is going to make grass stay greener longer in the summertime. That's a big deal because we run out of grass pretty quick in the summer.
Yeah, I just want to add in there, I think sometimes we get too early in our applications, and that it's really easy to measure from a stocker standpoint because it's more measurable. I think on stocker cattle, just on grass alone, you can expect 2 pounds of gain per day minimum, just on grass, no supplements. I think a majority of that is gained in the first 60 days. And so if you can delay some of those applications to extend your season, I think you can get better quality and more gains later on throughout the season, which you mentioned early in the beginning, what cattle are worth today. If we can put more pounds of gain on more effectively, more efficiently, I think that's to everybody's benefit. And so timing of applications really matters, whether you're going on hay production or whether you're going on grazing. So split applications is something to think about too. Don't put it all on at one time. Unless you're stocking it really, really heavy, I think you can sometimes get out ahead of yourself and not really utilize all those dollars that you're spending to grow that grass.
Well, and I think our utilization rates probably increase as we delay that application of fertilizer on into May, because like David mentioned, more times than not, obviously depending on what Mother Nature gives us for rainfall, we've got ample amount and a lot of times too much forage in the spring. And a lot of times it gets ahead of us, and the cattle, then become selective on what they're grazing. Some of that grass becomes more mature than others. And so we lose some utilization just by the fact of us pushing our grass probably too hard, too early. If we were to do like David mentioned and allow those cattle to graze across that ground, and once we start to see kind of the decline in forage production or that the cows are getting ahead, then add some fertility. And that's, we're not really changing probably the amount of forage that we're growing. We're just broadening out that curve, right? It's now not as steep in the beginning months of spring, but it's more broad. And so that gives us more grass, more palatable grass longer into the summer. So yeah, I think that's spot on. The other thing I would add there is that, and David, you were probably going to mention this, is that one thing that producers forget, especially adding it early, is Mother Nature can rob us of some of that nitrogen if we're not protecting it. So if you are set on, well, I would say anytime, but specifically early in the spring, make sure you're using a product that's going to protect that nitrogen, like Super U, that essentially protects it from all three forms of losses. Because if we're putting it on there that early, that fertilizer is going through, hopefully, a lot, well, maybe not for the person that put it on early, but for everybody else, a lot of rain events to grow grass. And those rain events have the potential to leach that nitrogen out of the soil and potentially waterlog that soil and lose it that way as well. And so protecting that nitrogen, whether it's an early spring or in a May application with a Super U product like that, I think can be very beneficial to us. Because a lot of times we think that even with the Super U product, I did this last fall, putting on some stockpiled forage fescue, used Super U, and it stayed so dry that, we were so dry in the fall that I assumed, 60 days after I made that application of nitrogen and we had not received any rain, that I had lost that nitrogen just from volatilization. Even with Super U, you're going to lose it over time to some degree with volatilization, but it protects it longer. But I was really surprised. We got some rain, and I think it was early November, and it was amazing how much grass I grew from November to the end of growing season, just because that nitrogen was still there. I had used that Super U product and it was still around. So anyways, yeah, I think it's crucial whether we're applying it in March or we're applying it in May to protect that investment. We all know, again, that input prices are fairly high right now, and so anything that we can do to protect that investment, I think, is good for our pocketbooks. So,
if I could jump in there for just a minute, you hit the nail on the head that we need to protect that nitrogen. The vast majority of nitrogen sold in our trade territory is not protected. So urea has the ability to volatilize, as you said, go up in the air. It can be lost through denitrification and leaching. Those two have to do with rain events when soil gets saturated. Well, here's the kicker. A lot of people want ammonium nitrate because they're afraid of that volatility. Ammonium nitrate can leach and it can denitrify, and it very frequently does. If you want to see what a difference can be made, put Super U on half of a field and put ammonium nitrate on the other half. They're roughly the same cost. Super U might be a tick higher than ammonium nitrate, but it's protected against all those losses. That's huge. And Brant, you hit the nail on the head with spoon feeding fertilizer. I, through the years, have really become a proponent for a number of reasons to spoon feeding grass throughout the year. Maybe I apply some of that fertilizer on pasture ground in May the 1st, and maybe I apply a little bit more on June 15th. But by doing that, I continue to stretch that green grass. Maybe I offer a 2 or 3 course meal to the cattle throughout the growing season. But the other thing I do is I minimize the amount of nitrate risk that I have when I apply lower amounts and apply it more frequently. I go back to that, don't hook onto the fertilizer cart and go spread all your acres. Do what's right for the cattle and do what's right for the grass, and the grass will do what's right for the cattle.
Yeah. In my mind, if you're going to start spreading fertilizer this early in the year, I know it's another trip across the pasture, but I often kind of wonder if it would be of a better benefit, put 30 units of nitrogen out now, come back in May, like you were mentioning earlier, and put another 30 out then, or whatever, how much ever you're planning to put out, just kind of split it and then stock it with high intensity and try to get more out of it and keep it fresh and keep the cattle on top of it.
That's you just mentioned one of the key takeaways too, and that's move cattle. Keep what's in front of them fresh and keep moving them. when we adopt the concept of not grazing or mowing lower than 4 inches on cool season grasses, we increase the number of tons of grass that we make, and we absolutely will increase the number of pounds of beef that we make.
Yeah, I mean, here I am, I'm a herbicide salesman, and that's why I should be pushing the biggest. But I'll tell you, as a producer, I think the biggest and best return on investment is rotational grazing. I think for the money you spend to do that, I think you get more back from it in terms of more efficiency, higher gains, higher efficiency rates than anything else you're going to do.
Yep. Second is killing weeds and lime, and third is getting the P and K on the soil.
Yep. David, you kind of hit on it there a little bit, and so I'll probably throw this back to you. But I was at a soil health workshop a couple weeks ago, and I attend several of those a year, just the way that my job aligns. And one of the presenters at that workshop said something that kind of caught me off guard, because I usually don't hear these types of management tips from in these soil health conferences, and that was that producers need to be looking to adding sulfur to their soils. And again, that kind of caught me off guard, because if we're and right, wrong, or indifferent, if we're doing good things for our soil, and we're trying to grow the biology, and we're trying to get the soil to work for us, in certain scenarios, there might be some instances where you may not have to add as much fertility, because you kind of got that race car running, right? You're doing good rotational grazing, you're moving them every day, they're distributing manure back on the fields. So I've heard that before, but to have her talk about adding sulfur back to our fields was kind of eye-opening to me. And I've heard you talk about this before, and you do a really good job of kind of explaining why sulfur is so important, that we should be adding that with every fertilizer pass we make on those fields. So if you don't mind, you've got that pulled up here. Talk us through why sulfur is so important.
Well, let's talk about why it's important to start with. And sulfur does two main things in our grass. Number one is it makes it, without sulfur, that grass cannot successfully photosynthesize. It cannot convert sunlight into energy for the plant. Number two is sulfur is a building block for the amino acids that are inside the plant. And amino acids come in multiple forms, but they're the building blocks of protein. So if I was to fertilize a field exactly the same all the way across the field, but I only apply sulfur to 1/2 of that field, what we see happen is that protein levels on the part that I add sulfur to will be a point or two higher than on the side that did not get sulfur. That may not sound like a big deal, but I'd much rather feed 12% protein hay than 10% protein hay. So that's kind of the long and the short of that. Now, though, why do we need to add it? This top picture of the United States shows the background level of sulfur in the soil in the United States in 1985. And the redder it is, the more sulfur there is there. And you can see the eastern half of the United States is basically pretty doggone red. So lots of sulfur. Why did we have that sulfur? Sulfur was coming from, our coal on the east half of the United States is what they call dirty coal. It had sulfur in it. And when we use that to generate electricity, we stuck some sulfur in the air. Those sulfur molecules collected in the clouds, and when combined with moisture, we got free sulfur. Didn't know we were getting it, but we were getting free sulfur every time it rained. The other source of that sulfur was diesel motors. Every diesel motor stuck some sulfur in the air. So what has changed? The bottom picture is 2017 background levels of sulfur in the soil in the whole United States. And you can see that sulfur's gone. We don't have background levels of sulfur in the soil anymore because they began shipping coal in from Wyoming, which is what they call clean coal. They either blend it with our dirty coal or replace our dirty coal with clean Wyoming coal. So we're getting less sulfur that starts out those smokestacks, and now they've got sulfur scrubbers in there to grab whatever is trying to escape. The other thing we have now is ultra low sulfur diesel fuel. So we just are not getting any free sulfur from the air, and it's indicated by the map on the bottom there. So how much sulfur do we need? In my mind, on pasture ground, we need about 8 pounds per acre per year. It's mobile in the soil, so even if you see that you got a little sulfur on a soil test, you need to understand that's a snapshot in time, that it may not be there. It's kind of like looking for snacks in a house that has teenagers in it. Just because you looked yesterday and there were snacks in the shelf doesn't mean they're going to be there tomorrow when you look. It's just sulfur can be gone, so we just need to apply it every year. Now, if we're looking at fescue hay, I think 12 to 16 units is about where we need to be. Once we get into alfalfa hay, Bermuda grass hay, corn, and beans, I think 16 to 24 units per acre per year is kind of where we need to be. Sulfur is not terribly expensive. It does add a little bit to our fertilizer bill, but it's absolutely necessary. I'm going to reiterate that. It is absolutely necessary.
I guess I've got a question for you on this, Landry. You're the big warm season guru. Do you think that warm season grass would respond to sulfur as well?
I think it would. And the reason that I say that to some degree, I have not seen side-by-side trials on native grass to I guess, verify that. But I'll go back to why that presenter at that soil health conference promoted sulfur. And that was because sulfur was kind of the building block for the soil biology to be able to increase nutrient uptake. For that, so if that biology is working like it should, it needs that sulfur to be able to do that. And so it's actually taking up and converting more phosphorus and more potassium and more nitrogen for that plant. And so I think that would only obviously benefit any plant that's growing in that condition, right? Whether it's warm season or cool season. So I think it would benefit. So yeah. The other thing I wanted to kind of hit on is, and I'm sure David and Brant have heard this from producers, but I've heard people say that, not necessarily ours, but fertilizer in general just doesn't work like it used to when my grandpa spread it. We just don't see the results we used to see when Dad spread fertilizer. Same amounts, but we don't see the results, the yield results. And I would almost think about, because the lack of sulfur, if that sulfur is helping that soil biology increase uptake, nutrient uptake into that plant, if that sulfur is a missing link, then that plant is not going to be able to uptake as much nutrients as it could with that sulfur being there. So I thought that was kind of interesting. It might be something to kind of look at from our side, from a research agronomy standpoint. But I think there's probably a lot of things with that sulfur that we're not really considering, just because we never had to apply it in the past. It wasn't a thing that we really thought of. And so I think that might be kind of a missing link, might be something to consider for folks, to making sure that we're adding that sulfur, whether it's in a sulfate form or elemental form. If it is an elemental, it's going to take a little longer to break down. So just consider that as well if you're going with an elemental form of sulfur. But yeah.
You brought up something that would be worthwhile for virtually anybody to do. I talked about splitting a field, applying sulfur to half of it and not applying it to the other half. There'd be a lot of benefit to that because you can see the results of sulfur. We talk about photosynthesis and how sulfur aids photosynthesis. If you put adequate nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium on the whole field, but you use two different buggies, you go back and get a buggy that's got 10 units of sulfur in it for a field. One of the things you're going to notice is the side you put sulfur on is greener. It is absolutely greener, and that's a result of what sulfur is doing to aid in photosynthesis. It's pretty huge. 20 units of sulfur, you can get that so green it's almost black. It's pretty wild how green you can make grass get.
Yeah. All right. Well, just to kind of wrap up nutrient management, I would throw out there for folks that are in Missouri listening to this, there is some cost share available. It kind of comes and goes as the years go on, but be looking for that if that's something that interests you. I know the University of Missouri Circle program has had some nutrient management incentives for producers. And then as well as some of the soil and water district counties. I know that Missouri Fertilizer Control Board has a kind of 4R pilot project that's been going on the last couple of years. There's some counties in the state. I think there's like 6 up in the north part of the state, and then there's actually one that got added this year down in the southwest part of the state. So if that's something that interests you, it might help look at some of these things that we're discussing, help offset maybe some of the cost, the input cost of those things to try and hopefully see the success and stick with. But just wanted to throw that out there as well. So anything else from a nutrient management standpoint, guys?
The only other thing that I thought we ought to hit on, phosphorus is expensive this year, and that's making it look like, fertilizer as a whole is expensive. The primary driver behind fertilizer being expensive this year is phosphorus. People ask me all the time, why is phosphorus so expensive? Well, if we could get Putin to start playing nice with the world again, we would eliminate a lot of additional tariffs that are put on fertilizer that comes from Putin, from Russia and from Russia-controlled countries. We'll say Russian friends, because more than 50% of the phosphorus in the world comes from Russia and Russian allies. So that makes phosphorus really expensive for us to get here. Well, those guys, Russia and their allies, don't use 50% of the phosphorus. The rest of the world does, and we're all scrambling, fighting over a smaller percentage of phosphorus in the world. So that's a deal. So the question becomes, do I put on phosphorus, or do I just say, no, I'm not going to put any on? I think not putting any on would be a disaster. Unless your soil test says that you have excessive levels of phosphorus, do not try to not put any on. I do think you ought to be really careful with the amount you put on. The best way to do that is to grid sample, follow NutriTrack recommendations, because it's going to tell you how much you need to put on and only how much you need to put on. I think that's big. I think that's really huge. Potash, on the other hand, is relatively cheap right now. We ought to be putting on, playing catch up on some of our potash. If you get to a hay field, if you don't have NutriTrack samples, put an extra 100 pounds of potash on, just because it gives you an opportunity to catch up. We pull a lot of potash off of hay fields, and we seldom put enough back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I had made a note here. My math's not good, so I had to do it beforehand, but 3 tons of cool season grass is going to pull about 150 units of potassium off. So keep that in mind. If you haven't been putting that much back on in the past, then you probably need to add that plus a little more to get caught back up to where you probably need to be. Yep. Good stuff. Transitioning a little bit away from maybe nutrient management. Well, still sticking with some nutrient management, I guess. But had a gentleman asked me the other day. He'd seen a sign on one of our buildings, Brant MFA buildings, that said Ultigraze. You being the Corteva expert here, I'm going to roll this over to you. But tell folks what Ultigraze is.
Yeah, I think Ultigraze is one of the things that's been most confusing people. They see that name and they think it's a product. And unlike that, it's kind of like NutriTrack in a way of thinking it's a program approach. It's the process of doing a good job of putting herbicide, incorporating that onto your dry fertilizer. So it's the whole process is what Ultigraze is being able to get a weed and feed all in one treatment. I think it's no secret that pasture acres are usually the last ones that folks want to do from a custom application standpoint. It's usually rough ground, smaller gates, trees, things get around. It makes it hard to get herbicide applications done to these type of places. So being able to put herbicide on dry fertilizer, hook onto a buggy and go out there and spread it just makes life a lot easier. It kind of cuts out a step. Just more efficient. Anything we can do to make things more efficient. Time is our biggest commodity. It's in short supply come springtime because there's a number of things going on. So if we can kind of really cut a step out there, just really helps make life a lot easier. Does it work every bit as good as spraying? No, probably not. Let's say 70-80% as good of weed control as if you had sprayed it. But then again, we're getting across acres that might not have gotten sprayed anyway. And so honestly, I think that if dollars are in short supply and you're trying to invest money into improving your forage production, I honestly think the best thing you can do is to get rid of the weeds first. If you're putting out that P and K and you've got a field full of weeds, I don't think you're utilizing it to its max potential. I think you should get the weeds under control first. If you can do both at the same time, that's great. Absolutely do it. But weed control, I think, is very important. It's just a general rule: for every 1 pound of weeds you get rid of, you grow 2 to 5 pounds of grass in its place. There's some different numbers different people use there, but that's just kind of a general thinking that if you get rid of the weeds, you'll grow more grass in its place. So just makes life easier being able to do it all in one step with multi-graze. And we're using something like DuraCore to get a long residual, broad spectrum of control. And so that's just kind of where my mind goes when you ask that question.
Yeah, absolutely. Dave, from a application timing standpoint, what are we looking at for folks? Again, I know it's hard to have that conversation with people, with producers that are accustomed to putting on fertilizer early. I said fertilize like I was from the boot hill. Fertilizer early. And anyways, so how do you have that conversation? What do you tell folks that are interested in this ultigraze or impregnating fertilizer? When's kind of the best time to be putting this on, and how do they go about that?
So contact your local MFA if you want to do it. They'll get you lined out on what you need to do. We have a 200 pound per acre minimum on the fertilizer, which on hay ground is really easy to meet. We probably ought to be putting 300 to 400 pounds on hay ground. But when I think about hay ground and using ultigraze, there's really 2 application timings. Late fall, you could control henbit, chickweed, teasel, thistles, mare's tail, a whole lot of things if you want to go in the late fall. Or we go back to that timing that I talked about before, that mid-March to mid-April timing. Once we get on to pasture ground, I like to switch it up just a little bit. We begin to have this balancing act of, I said earlier, I'd like to apply fertilizer late April to the middle of May. We have this balancing act because for the DuraCore to work best in the fertilizer, it really needs to be there at or very near emergence of the weeds. So I'm thinking May 1 is a great time. There's nothing wrong with April 15th. I do start thinking about how long my residual is going to last. And if I apply it April 15th, and if I'm lucky and we get a full 90 days of residual, that's going to take me up into mid-July. If I apply it May 15th and get 3 months, that'll get me up into August. And usually summer weeds is what most people are after. Ragweed, #1 driver weed in the state of Missouri. So ragweed's going to begin emerging in pastures sometime, the 10th to the 20th of May, occasionally a little bit before that. So I would like to be there when it begins to emerge.
Yeah, I think we have to have proper expectations when we think about timing and length of residual. And what is our target weeds? If our main targets are things like poison hemlock, musk thistle, this early time frame is great. But then putting it out in February 16th, if we have things like ironweed, woolly croton, pigweed, some of those things might show up come July or late summer.
Absolutely.
And so generally we get that question. Had a really good weed control, put fertilizer, put ultigraze out early. But then, gosh, I've got some woolly croton coming up in July. And so just have to really pay attention to what are our goals, what are our main problems, and then try to time that application for the proper timing for what our main targets are. Hard to do everything at the right time, every time for everything, but just have to try to hit the big targets and make it intentional.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, the other thing to consider there, and from an expectation standpoint, is that, moisture, soil moisture and soil temperatures is what kind of affects the residual capabilities or properties of that herbicide. And so the earlier we put it on, the more likely we're going to see rainfall, intense rainfall going into spring. And so that is diluting or reducing the the capabilities of that herbicide as we go further into spring. And so I'm kind of like David, if
We
you're
saw
already in
that
that
last year,
mindset,
too.
yeah, absolutely. And obviously it does depend on what your driver weed is, but if your driver weed is say ragweed or maybe some of these early summer weeds, and you always put on fertilizer in May, this is an awesome product for you. Like there's no reason that you shouldn't be using it. Or maybe you're a guy that puts on fertilizer earlier in the spring, but you're thinking about maybe putting on some later spring fertilizer, like we mentioned, to extend that growth curve of these forages. That's an awesome place for that. Because I think, after we get over that hump of our spring rains, then we see a little bit longer residual out of the herbicide that we use, whether it's impregnated or spraying, just because we don't have those intense rainfall events that might be reducing the capabilities of that the residual herbicide. So sorry, David, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, that's fine. Brant, you absolutely struck a nerve with me, and that's identifying what are you after. Am I after something that's out there today that's not giving me a whole lot of grief, but I don't like the way it looks, or am I after the number one yield robber, ragweed? Hands down, ragweed steals. And if I can get Duracor on that acre in any form, I won't have ragweed there. That's just huge. But then occasionally I have somebody say, I got all my ragweed, but gosh, I had dock out there and it didn't do enough with the dock to make me happy. Well, dock's really hard to control about any time, unless you go really, really early. It's another one that's a biennial that, it's kind of in its infant stages late in the fall. And if we'd make an application then, we'd probably clean it up. But if we're making that application in May, it's going to be a little tough to get. You want to add on to that, Brant?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think what we have learned, we've used Ultigrace for a number of years now, and I think one of the things we've learned is that just because that herbicide controls that weed when we spray it does not always mean it's going to get the same level or adequate control when we put it on fertilizer, because we lose coverage. We're relying on the residual uptake of that herbicide, and so then we lose one of our modes of entry. So there's just a handful of weeds that we probably don't see the same level or expectation of control that we do when we spray it. And in my opinion, there's a few of them out there. You mentioned dock. I'm just thinking mustard. The early spring yellow rocket mustard is one that we can control when we spray it, but when we put it on fertilizer, sometimes it's just kind of a miss, and it needs coverage to get that herbicide on and in that plant. And so just know that there's a big difference in performance. Sometimes it's weed specific. It's not, we paint with a broad brush and think everything should kind of in equals, but some weeds just respond to residual control only, and versus when we get coverage with spraying, it's a little bit better.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. Those early weeds, I'm gonna hit on those real quick. Get the phone call. I got yellow flowers out there. What do I need to spray? Well, I have to stop and think about timing. There's 3 different yellow flowers that cause us issues. The first one we see in the year, and usually is in roadside ditches, but it does spill into pastures, and that is the yellow rocket, the mustard that Brant was just talking about. If you wait until you got yellow flowers, you are not for sure going to get that with impregnated fertilizer, and you might not get it with a spray application. It's tough. The next one is buttercup, and that one comes along 3 weeks or so after the yellow rocket starts. Buttercup's a perennial, shows up all over the fields. You don't often see it in the roadside ditches. It's in the fields. And again, if you wait until you see yellow flowers, it's going to be hard to control. It would be better if you know it's in that field to go out there, a month before it turns yellow and spray it then with Duracor. The last one is bitter sneezeweed, and that one comes in the summertime. But that's our 3 yellow flowers. So I have to think a little bit about timing. I have to think about product. Bitter sneezeweed is one that tends to come when there's no vegetation out there. I think of really super abused horse pastures when I think of bitter sneezeweed. I can kill it with Duracor. It's likely going to be back next year because there's nothing there to compete with it, unless we make some really big wholesale changes in those fields.
Yep. Well, and I think, we're talking about impregnating fertilizer, but I think that goes for spray applications as well. A lot of times, again, I'm guilty of it, is going out there and realizing I've got a problem with weeds probably before, even though I've had problems with that weed in that same pasture year in and year out. It seems like by the time I get to noticing it, or it puts on a nice pretty flower, and I realize that those weeds are out there, we're kind of past that window of having a good success of killing that. So it makes sense to kind of, and we all have it, we all know it, we just probably don't do a good job with implementing it. But knowing what weeds we have issues with, where in our fields and our farms we're having issues with, and just go out there, especially with the product like DuraCore, and spray those areas when we know they're going to be probably actively growing before they put on a nice pretty flower or a seed head. So yeah, just that's really good stuff. I'm going to transition just a little.
Set a meeting in your calendar for next spring.
There you go. Yeah.
Spray the bottom 40 for buttercup on whatever day. If you look at the first day you saw buttercup flowers and back it up 3 or 4 weeks so that you'll spray it when it's vegetative instead of reproductive, you'll probably be successful.
Yep. The other thing I wanted to hit on here is a product called NovaGraze. It's kind of a fairly new product over the last couple years, but it's starting to pick up some traction in our territory, and people are kind of realizing what it is. And so, again, Brant, as the expert here from Corteva, why don't you kind of tell folks what NovaGraze is, why people would use it, and some things like that.
Yeah, NovaGraze is kind of an interesting option because it's a little bit unique in that it will control the weeds without also taking out all of the desirable legumes. Now, it's specific to white clover and annual Lespedeza. Not a safe option to use on the red, but for those of you who are trying to incorporate some legumes, you can incorporate some legumes in a more diverse forage base with things like white clover, your Ladino varieties, your Cobra, your Korean Lespedeza. And this time of the year is the time of year to start thinking about some of that. If you still got time to frost or seed or drill some of those legumes yet to get some benefit out of those into your fescue-based pastures, I think that's a great idea. And then, so if you have weed problems later on, you do have an option that you can use over the top of that will get you good weed control. There is some things to think about with it. It's not as broad a weed control as, say, DuraCore. DuraCore we promote because it's got 140 different weeds listed for control. NovaGraze, not quite that many. I'm thinking it's in the 30 or 40 weeds listed on there in that range. But some of those weeds that are listed on there are some of the main ones that we have issues with. David, you mentioned ragweed. It's really good on that. Thistle, hemlock, mint, buttercup, to mention just a few. It's really good on those. So you really want to make sure, though, that what weeds are out there to make sure it is going to control what you have. It will, even though the white clover is tolerant to it, it will suppress or set it back for a couple, 2-3 weeks after application, so it will be noticeable. But by about 3 and 4 weeks after, it grows right back out of it and recovers. And then by the end of it, kind of what we have seen is that you have a lot more legumes, a lot more diverse forage base, and a lot more grass by getting rid of its competition. So there's a lot of folks, I hear it all the time, have heard it for a long time. You have to kill my clover. And so that's been one of the biggest asks that I have heard in my time doing this. So it's a great option that fits that need.
So right now is a time there's a lot of people out there putting some clover on their pastures. One of the things, if Proclova sounds, if you've got a weed problem in those fields, because a lot of them have not seen any weed control in a long time. If you're getting ready to add some clover seed to those fields, give some serious thought to putting 1 pound of Will Ladino clover and about 5 pounds of annual Lespedeza on this year instead of your red clover. Nutritionally, you'll be equivalent with that, equivalent or better with the 1 pound and 5 pounds than you will with 4 or 5 pounds of red clover. And you're going to have the opportunity to spray NovaGraze and have some impact on the weeds that have been choking your clover out for a long time. I think that's important. if you guys will indulge me for just 1 second, I'm going to sneak one in on you, Landry. One thing Brant just mentioned, he mentioned a weed that I want to make sure everybody sees a picture of, and that is Perilla mint. I want to show you the picture of it. If I can find it here real quick. That's a picture of Perilla mint. That is the most toxic weed we have in the state of Missouri. It doesn't take very many bites of that to create a dead animal. Not very many at all. You need to be looking for it. It tends to grow in shadier, wetter areas, so along creeks, underneath the trees, edges of fields. The problem that we run into, if you look at the bottom of this picture, there's grass growing here where the perilla is spilling out into the field. So you see at the bottom here, there's some new perilla mint plants starting in the midst of that grass, and those will continue sometimes 30, 40, 50 feet out into the pasture. Cow grazes along, getting a mouthful of grass, mouthful of grass, mouthful of grass, and perilla mint, and they do that a couple more times, and before you know it, we've got a dead animal. So it is important to understand what that weed is. It is controllable with fertilizer impregnation. It is controllable with Novagraze. It is controllable with spray and Duracor. At the very least, make 2 passes around your field, throw in fertilizer or throw in spray into the woods as far as you can. Control as much of the perilla mint as you can. Generally speaking, they don't consume it. Generally speaking, if they're hungry, something's going to take a bite of it. So kind of keep that in mind. We saw some real issues with running low on hay in the winter of 23, and we began to ration hay, and they'd find skeletons of perilla mint and take a bite of it. And we had, multiple incidents where we lost multiple animals in one day just because they were taking bites of dry, crunchy perilla mint. It's toxic when it's green. It's toxic when it's dry and crunchy. It's toxic in a bale of hay. So just want to bring that up.
Yeah, just a couple
What
other
else
points I
you got
wanted
for
to
us,
make
Landry?
on Novagraze. I was just going to say a couple other points on Novagraze. It need to make sure that it is it's not cannot be put on with Ultigraze. It's a foliar application, needs to be sprayed. The reason for that is it's not got a lot of residual, and so make sure the weeds are up, but hopefully small or actively growing when you make the application. So time that right. My opinion, the best kind of windows for applications, if you got biannuals, early season type stuff, you can do it in March and April, but for the most of the summer complex of weeds, that May and even June time frame for your ragweed, for your summer type weeds, croton, things like that. I think that May and June time is also a good window to do it, just depending on what you got. And the rate range on that says all the way from 24 to 48 ounces. Might be confusing. My suggestion would be to use 24 to 32. Kind of that rate is kind of where I would do it and get it on a timely application. And so just want to make those 2 other points on it.
Yeah.
A couple other quick things on Novagraze. Like Brant said, number 1, don't expect any residual activity. The surfactant that you want to use, don't use a regular surfactant. I want you to use Soy Plus. You have to use a methylated seed oil with that for it to be effective. Okay, that's a really big deal. You can make 2 applications a year. You cannot exceed 64 ounces in a year, or no, 48 ounces in a year. So if you apply 24 ounces, 60 days later, you can apply 24 ounces again. So that might help you through the late season escapes by applying twice. One last thing to say about it, when we say that the white clover and the annual Espinosa survives, we're not necessarily saying that it's gentle. I probably in the past have been guilty of using that word gentle, and it's especially on the white clover, it's really not very gentle. You're going to want to call me and say, David Moore, you've lied to me because my clover is laying flat on the ground and it's yellow and I think it's going to die. Well, it won't. Over the course of the next 3 weeks or so, it is going to slowly get better. Color will resume. It'll begin to stand back up, and before you know it, it'll look just like it did before. That's what to expect. I want to make sure that we create the right expectations so that you can anticipate tomorrow this is what it's going to start looking like. Okay. Kind of like with dry
Yep.
fertilizer impregnation. You'll be happy if we tell you what it will do and what it won't do. One last thing on dry fertilizer impregnation, that is for weeds. It is not for brush. So if you have buckbrush, don't think it's going to fix it. If you have blackberries, don't think it's going to fix it. You will kill some multiflora rows. We've seen that. You're not going to kill all of it. You may think you killed your blackberries, but they're going to grow back out of it. For whatever reason, they're just tough. We appreciate everybody's time today.
Yeah, good stuff. No, and I would just add as well, I guess, on that overgrazes, I've heard you both say that it gets in a pasture application to keep grazing those fields. Sometimes because it knocks that clover down a little bit, sometimes that grass can outcompete it and overtake that clover, and then you will start to see some loss or thinning of your clovers, mainly just because it can't compete with that grass. So keep grazing it, keep grazing that grass to make sure that it doesn't outcompete that clover until that clover can kind of stand back up on its own and have its feet underneath it, and then it's off to the races again. Yeah. So the only two things I was going to add here before we kind of shut this thing down was just from a management standpoint. And because I've seen this myself, been feeding cattle hay here this winter, and up until we got this rain and some warm temperatures, they haven't varied too far from where those hay rings or where I unroll that hay. But here the last few days, they've been out searching for green grass and picking that grass that's starting to emerge. So I think that's one of the hardest things that we can do to our grass is to turn them cattle out too early when it's trying to recuperate from last fall and last summer, and it's putting growth above ground. Is if we can, let's create a sacrifice paddock. We know we're still going to have to feed hay. Winter's not over. Shut that gate. Put them up into a field that you can kind of sacrifice and unroll hay or put hay out for them so that they're not out grazing that new, 1-inch tall, 2-inch tall grass that they may be seeing out there. It's tough to do because we all don't want to feed hay, but we still got some months ahead of us before we can shut that feed truck off or park that tractor in the barn. So consider finding a sacrifice paddock for those animals until we've got ample amount of forage to turn them out. And then the last thing that I was going to kind of hit on was just species diversity. It's a little bit early. We talked about it some, but it's never too early to start creating a plan on, if we're going to have some warm season forages out there, or if we're going to be doing some clovers and using overgraze. Start thinking about how we can diversify those forages so we can create as much yield out there on our acres as possible. And a lot of times that comes in the form of outside of that cool season grass realm. We leave some months sitting out there in the summertime that we could be growing some highly productive forage, whether that's an annual or perennial, or a native grass, whatever that might be. So just, again, that's time of year where we're kind of sitting here waiting for the grass to green up and get outside to become more active. Now's a good time to start creating those plans of how we're going to, change our management moving forward, do some things a little bit different that we haven't done in the past. And so, anyways, that's really all I've got to add, gentlemen. Do you have anything else?
I don't at this time. Keep growing grass. You'll keep growing pounds of beef.
No, right? Just hope for continued prosperity and cattle markets to look like they are right now.
Yes, sir. All right.
Amen.
Well, thank you. Appreciate you all joining us. Thanks for everyone joining us today, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you for listening to Made for Agriculture, brought to you by MFA, your whole farm solution.